I get three words for you. I read this. I read these words. I think it's the KDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review, at the Pentagon.
Yeah, the
Every 4
Quadrennial
years.
Defense
Yeah.
Review. Yeah.
I think it's in that where they use the term full spectrum dominance, and I think that's land, sea, air, and space.
Yeah.
And there's also terms I hear often in various news articles: peer competitor, as in knocking down a peer competitor. Any nation has ambitions of building a military a tenth the size of ours, and the word hubris. And do you think, when you say things like, you've offered a lot of good policy proposed in terms of what our government should do abroad, what would you say to the suggestion that the problem with foreign policy is, and I read this I think Murray Rothbard mentioned this in a book he wrote back in the 70s, the problem with foreign policy is the monopoly of the federal government, and the federal government has too much power. Do you really think the federal government, the type of people that seek federal power, that come to power through our foreign policy established, the military, will they acknowledge the fact that there are such things as limits to power, and there's such things as prudence and humility? And do you think that the problem isn't so much is wrong policy, it's the fact that the nature of our government, that our federal government really has become an empire, and it needs to be checked not only in terms of changing policy, but changing the nature of our government. Do you understand the question?
Yeah,
Okay.
I do understand, and I think you raise a very good point. Unfortunately, given the nature of the political and bureaucratic processes, the people who favor the most aggressive, hands-on, proactive policies tend to rise to the top, and people who advocate restraint usually find their careers ended prematurely or stalled at the middle level. This, again, I don't think there's any, that it's coincidence that the rise of the American empire tracks almost perfectly with the rise of the Leviathan state at home. Both of these manifestations were taking place at the same time, and they are mutually reinforcing. So, yeah, if we're going to get a change in policy, I think we have to change the overall structure of the government to get any lasting change in policy. Whether that's feasible or not in the near term, I'm at least rather pessimistic on that score. But clearly expecting a Leviathan state to change its policies 180 degrees is expecting too much. At best, you would get a modest beneficial adjustment as some of the more prudent types perhaps get a little more influence than they would otherwise have. This certainly followed the Vietnam debacle. I expect we'll see some manifestation of that following the Iraq debacle, but again, that's maybe 5 or 10% of the change that we actually need in policy. Harry?
Hi, Ted. There's one name that has not even been mentioned tangentially at this conference, or the role of that individual, and that's April Glaspie. Where is she? Where is her book?
I honestly don't know where she is. She was around the Washington lecture circuit for a brief time following the first Gulf War, but I have no idea where she is at the moment. April Glaspie was the diplomat who, just prior to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, apparently signaled to Saddam that the United States wouldn't particularly care if Iraq took military action against Kuwait. Now, she has always said that she never intended to convey a green light to Saddam's regime to invade and take over Kuwait. I suspect what she was conveying was, in fact, the policy of the State Department, but it was the policy that if Iraq used limited coercion against Kuwait to settle the border dispute, to settle the dispute over some of the oil fields near the border, that the United States wouldn't particularly care about that. What the Bush administration, the elder Bush administration, did not realize that Saddam's objective, as it had been of every Iraqi government since Kuwait became independent, was to take that territory. Every Iraqi regime said this was rightfully part of Iraq. And the U.S., I think, inadvertently gave Saddam what he certainly saw as a green light to just take over this disputed territory. And Saddam was mightily surprised when the U.S. reaction was very, very different. It is interesting, though. There are reliable reports that right after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, there was an emergency cabinet meeting. And when Bush went around the table asking for the reaction of various officials, Secretary of State James Baker reported, well, I guess the sign on the gas station just changed. He wasn't particularly concerned, but he soon got indications from the president and other officials that if that was his attitude, his career was about to come to an abrupt end, and he promptly got on board for more action against Iraq to reverse that invasion. But Glaspie, I think, was simply a messenger here, accurately conveying what the State Department policy was, but that Saddam misread what that policy was, overestimated. Yes?
Yes, I want to ask you some questions about the drug situation in Afghanistan. I think I've read in previous articles that when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, that they had harsh repressive measures against the farmers and would threaten to cut off their hands and kill their children, and coca planting had gone down severely. Then the Americans came in after the invasion, and their solution was to buy the crops ourselves. Yes, you know, the country was to buy the crops, and I didn't know if that program was still in effect, or we still buying it, and if we are, where's it kept?
First of all, with regard to the Taliban, there was an edict issued in 2000 imposing tremendously harsh penalties for anyone growing, it's not coca in Afghanistan, it's opium poppies for heroin. However, the Taliban did that only after stockpiling enormous quantities of opium. And what the Taliban regime was doing was trying to create an artificial shortage to drive up the prices of the stocks that they owned. And that's exactly what happened. Interestingly enough, I think that was actually a significant factor, that this edict prohibiting the growing of opium poppies alienated so many of the Afghan farmers that was a major reason why the Taliban regime fell so quickly after the U.S.-led invasion in 2001 and the cooperation with the Northern Alliance. A lot of Afghan farmers had been alienated. We have not been buying up the crop. That has been suggested as an alternative, but U.S. officials have consistently resisted that. And now we're the drug warriors, and we're having the reversal of the process in 2000, 2001, where the Taliban alienated the Afghan farmers. Now the U.S. and the Karzai government are both alienating the Afghan farmers. Yes.
Do you believe it would be sufficient to show the world that we've returned to the principles of the Founding Fathers to bring all of our troops home now from everywhere, stop all foreign aid to everyone, and get out of the United Nations, or do you believe there are other measures that would be necessary?
Withdrawing our forces would be one of the most visible signals that our policy had changed, and changed dramatically. Interestingly enough, the cessation of foreign aid, although that's certainly desirable from the standpoint of both economics and political policy, might in the short term have the opposite effect, that it suggests that the U.S. is indifferent about the fate of third world societies. That's how it would be read, and I think we would have the task of trying to show, look, we've tried this strategy for 50-some years and it has been a miserable flop, and by the way, it's helped fund all these regimes that you regard as so terribly odious.